From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And coming up during our first half hour, a visit with the presenter of the latest Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture here at K-State. From Gro Intellegence, Sara Menker, on why there doesn't have to be a global food crisis. She'll talk about how data and technology can help pave the way toward greater food productivity in areas of the world where food issues will be most prominent. And she talks about how her firm has determined that the critical date for meeting those food challenges is not the year 2050, rather less than a decade away. Sara Menker with us next. Further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee talks about why feral cats are not a good control solution for rat problems. Plus more here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You are tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Glad to have you aboard for our Tuesday edition. Well, last evening here on the campus, the 5th Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture was presented, and this is a series that is named for the longtime Kansas cattle producer and leader in the agriculture industry, Henry Gardiner, and it brings to light contemporary topics in global food systems and feeding the world as we move forward with the challenges ahead. No better person to bring in this year to talk about those matters than the founder and chief executive officer of something that's known as Gro Intellegence. Her name is Sara Menker. Sara, you have a tremendously interesting story. We want to get into that here in a moment, but welcome to K-State, first of all.
Thank you for having me.
You started actually as a commodities broker in your profession, is that right?
Yes. I started my career at Morgan Stanley, and I started as a risk manager and then moved on to become a trader. And so that was my one and only job before starting my own company, Gro Intellegence. And
what led you to start Gro Intellegence? And we do want then to outline what the company is all about.
Yeah. So obviously, as a commodities trader, you know, you're constantly buying and selling contracts because you believe prices are going up or down. I actually used to be an energy trader, but in 2008, 2009, when the financial crisis was happening and we were living the reality of that, I started looking at agriculture as another kind of set of commodities, just out of interest initially, really. And the more I dug into it, the more I became completely obsessed with understanding our agricultural system and our food systems globally, and decided to quit my job and start a company focused on that instead.
Well, explain to us what Gro Intellegence is then.
Yeah. Gro Intelligence is AI for agriculture. It's artificial intelligence for agriculture. So we've built software that lets our users and our clients discover information that impacts the availability and prices of food much faster than they ever were able to do so before. So in a nutshell, it's really a software that enables both discovery of data and information as it relates to our global food systems and our global agricultural systems, because agriculture is actually more than food, and also enables predictions of what's coming at a very large and global scale.
And, of course, we want to get into the predictive side of that. But when you talk about data technology here and clientele, whom are you trying to reach?
Yeah, so we, you know, if you think of the ecosystem, you know, the core of the ecosystem is the farmer. The farmer is producing product. Oddly enough, the farmers who we're not selling to, who we sell to and who we work with, are people who are either providing services and inputs to the farmers, so input companies, chemicals, seeds companies, etc., or even policymakers that are setting policy that drive it, people who are providing capital to farmers, banks, insurance companies, etc., as well as people who are buying from farmers, so your food and beverage companies, your wholesalers, etc. And part of why we're doing that is that we believe that to make the system function well, it goes a lot more beyond helping farmers farm better, which we're spending a lot of time and technology enabling that, but very little had been done to say, how do we get the system that sits around the farmer to be well-informed and efficient, because that will then translate also to goods for the farmer.
You bring it up. Where are those inefficiencies in the system as you would view them currently?
Well, for one of the things that the industry's been built off of is just silos. Silos in terms of knowledge about a particular crop, or silos in terms of regional knowledge about that region, but not as it sits around the world. And one thing that we know about agriculture is that it's anything but siloed. There's relationships across countries. It's a global system. And there's relationship across crops, because what you decide to plant one year versus the next is oftentimes driven by economics and pricing, combined with preference and taste of consumers. And so understanding that as a system and how all of those pieces work together is key. How it's happened in the past is that, really large organizations that have access to a lot of money essentially built really large research teams, each with one single individual expert for one thing, and try to merge all of that, but none of it is automated. What we've taken is said, how do we take the knowledge and the domain expertise that exists, and how do you automate that knowledge so that it can be broadly accessed by many more than what typically access it today?
And this knowledge has led you to something of a cause, if you will, in terms of feeding the world, and the year often cited by the year 2050 as the critical point at which the world needs to seriously address food needs and food shortages and distribution issues, so forth. But actually, you suggest that the, as you call it, tipping point for all of that is likely to show up much sooner than 2050.
Yes. And the reason is, one of the things that fascinated me, or a thing I'd never asked a question about, is how did we come up with the term, how do we feed 9 billion people by 2050? I wanted to understand where 2050 came from. And so we decided to build a model that just said, well, we're not going to look at 2050. We're just going to look at our global food system, and we're going to forecast our overall ability to produce and our overall consumption, and what our long-term consumption trends are going to be, and look at the difference between the two to understand where we're headed as a world. And when we did that math, we quickly realized that the tipping point was not 2050, but that it was 2027. And it was going to be driven by a combination of some serious demographic shifts that are occurring. India, China, and the continent of Africa, all rapidly growing populations. Those three intersect in terms of being equal size by 2023. But also you have fast growing economies in all three cases. And so that just means fast growing demand and an inability of supply to keep up with that if we don't change the way that we're growing food today, if we don't change the efficiency in the system that I'm talking about. It's about getting capital in the hands of farmers in the most efficient way, in the lowest cost capital form. It's about essentially creating markets that allow us to move food. So it's not just producing it, you have to be able to move it. And so for us, we were shocked to find that, that difference between what's been taken as a truth versus what we believe is actually the real case. And, you can't change things once it's too late.
Now, you're sharing this message frequently on social media, in presentations such as the one last evening here at Kansas State. What's been the response that you've garnered from those that hear that this is an urgency more so than maybe was previously thought?
Very mixed. There's some response, which is actually healthy debate around, I want to understand how you built this. This is not what our assumption was. How did you get to it? And just like real intellectual debate, which is really interesting because it helps refine our models. We're not sharing the model as if it's a truth. We're saying this is an outcome and an output we've seen. We receive a lot of hate mail from time to time. And that's from people who believe that, one of the messages that I share is that some level of commercialization of agriculture and developing economies is inevitable for the system to work well. Subsistence farming is not going to take us out of this. And that message essentially to some people translates as you're trying to change the world to being all about corporate farming and therefore you are evil. And that's not the message I'm sending. So it's varied.
But the message you are sending, and we can dig into this as far as is practical here, is that in certainly the hot spots that you mentioned, potentially China, but maybe even more over India and Africa, a combination of commercialization and small-scale farming may well be the solution to pursue?
Yeah, it's, this concept of commercialization is really hard to kind of switch on if you don't have policy that lets it happen. And so it starts with transforming and changing policy to some extent in a lot of these economies. It's also about getting the financial system, both the banking and the insurance ecosystem, to be a lot more informed about the real-time signals that occur. Because ultimately, if I'm a bank and I need to lend to farmers, I need to understand on a real-time basis what my risk is and what my exposure to farmers is. And so we need to start transforming also private institutions that live in these countries and operate in these countries to really be a lot more data oriented, so that they're also able to be able to deploy the capital.
Is that a hard sell in a lot of ways?
It is, because you're changing the way things have been done for hundreds of years. So there's nothing easy about it, but it needs to happen.
Right. This initiative really hits home for you. We didn't mention this earlier. You're originally from Ethiopia, correct?
Correct, yes. I grew up there.
So when you talk about introducing new ideas, food production in Africa in this instance, you know of what you speak as to the challenges, right?
Yes. I not only grew up in Ethiopia, I actually grew up in Ethiopia in the 80s when food was rationed, and it was very different, and it was the time of the famine as well, and so it was a very different context than where it is today, because there's a lot of progress that's been made. But there's still a lot more to do. I mean, average farm sizes continue to be really small, and a commercial ecosystem doesn't exist.
Sara, we need to take a break. We'd like to explore this a little further. If you could stand by, we appreciate your thoughts and want to get more from our guest, who is the 5th Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecturer at Kansas State University. Once more, she's the founder and Chief Executive Officer of Gro Intellegence. Sara Menker is her name, and we'll return with Sara and with more after these moments away. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Agriculture Today is back now on the K-State Radio Network. In the guest chair is the presenter of the Henry C. Gardiner Global Food Systems Lecture here at Kansas State last evening, and that lecture series gets into contemporary topics and thoughts concerning feeding the world in the years ahead. Sara Menker, she is the founder and CEO of Gro Intellegence. We told you what that's all about here earlier in our visit. Sara, picking up where we left off, when we discuss global food needs and these initiatives you've been talking about, you and Gro Intellegence have put this in an interesting context in regard to what is needed out there, not so much in bushels or tons or volume, but in caloric need, calories. You might expand on that.
Yeah, so when we were looking at this, balance between supply and demand, it's a simple equation: supply minus demand, or demand minus supply, whichever, side you're looking at it as. But when doing just basically bushels or tons, the issue you come up with is that you assign the same value to a ton of corn as to a ton of cassava. And so what happens is that when you look at continents like Africa, if you actually just looked at tonnage, they would look like they're in excess supply mode. And the reason is that a ton of cassava just has so low caloric content, that if you don't adjust for what calories we're actually consuming, because that's what we consume, volume is not the right metric for it. And so we took the model and we basically adjusted the model for calories. So we took the volumes and changed them to calories and got a very, very different picture, but a picture that is actually more accurate in the world that we know it today than just simply looking at tons versus tons.
You tie that back to the tipping point of 2027 then. How short on the caloric scale will world food supplies be as we look to that critical time?
It's 214 trillion calories is what we came up with. And that's, again, looking at, overall supply, overall demand, and then forecasting that out. And so when we looked at the demand forecasts, it's really understanding shifts in longer-term economic shifts that are occurring, which means dietary shifts into things like consumption of protein, which has implications for the feedstock that the animals need to eat for you to consume the meat. But also on the supply side, looking at and saying, what's the potential upside that each country in the world has in essentially the yield gap. So if you think of the yield gap, it's saying what's the reality of yields today for a particular crop, and then what's the theoretical maximum yield that it could hit. And the reality is you cannot hit your theoretical maximum yield unless you've transformed the system, because you can't quintuple yield without some type of change. And so what we did is we said, well, if the system remains as it is now, that's not happening. So that's how the model was built. Now, there is a version of that model where you say, if we change it and we are able to double or triple yields, it looks significantly different. And so that question is the question that we need to spend a lot of time on. How do we do that?
A good lead into the question of where production agricultural technology fits in. Technologies like genetically modified organisms, like gene editing, they have to be a factor in all of this, do they not?
Absolutely. But again, this ties back to technology that exists at the seed level, but also at the farm management level, right? It's how equipment works today, etc. All of that has been purposed and really designed. I mean, seeds less so, but distribution of seeds have been designed for larger markets, not very small-scale markets. And equipment is built for larger farms, not small-scale farms. And so part of what we have to do is come up with a balancing act of how do we repurpose technologies that exist to make them fit the rest of the ag ecosystem outside of countries like the U.S. or Brazil or Argentina, where you have, very large-scale agriculture, and get to a middle ground where you're not trying to optimize them to work for half-acre plots or 2-acre plots either, but rather some medium in between where that transfer of technology can happen. Today, the amount of technology available does not necessarily translate to technology that's usable in places.
The definition of small-scale agriculture will then vary by location in the world, will it not?
Yes, and it does to some extent. I mean, in the U.S., small-scale agriculture outside of your garden, right, which is not small-scale agriculture, is still, in the hundreds of acres. In sub-Saharan Africa or in India or in China, small-scale agriculture is half an acre, is 2 acre. I mean, I think the average farm in the U.S. is, I think if you look at an average, which is the wrong number to look at, but it's over 400 acres. The average in China is half an acre.
There's a sociological aspect to so much of this. Yeah. That has to be one of the really huge hurdles to overcome, doesn't it? Change on a sociological scale in some of these countries? Huge,
because if you think about it, a lot of these countries are also young, right? And so there's a lot of assumption around, what do you do with the youth if they're not farming? There's not enough jobs in urban areas. Unemployment rates are really high in these countries. And so part of the discussion in agriculture actually needs to happen side by side with discussions in education. And I'm always baffled by the fact that when having large development agriculture conferences, you've never seen ministers of education show up to this. And the reality is you kind of need that, because saying that, the youth of tomorrow are going to be farmers forever is the wrong assumption. But saying that, okay, our ag system is changing and our local system will change with it. But for that change to occur, I recognize that I'm going to create a huge unemployment problem. And so therefore, the way I solve it is by redesigning our educational systems to be able to deal with what employment of the future actually looks like. That conversation doesn't exist at all.
And that's probably one of your objectives, to make that conversation get going.
At least start it.
When you look, Sarah, at U.S. agriculture and agricultural research specifically, what can the research sector in this country contribute to this cause?
Well, I mean, I think it has been already in many ways, because a lot of public sector research in the U.S. is open source and is published. But I do think thinking about kind of that extra layer of how does it get applied is really what's key, right? So it's not the research versus thinking of innovative applications of the research in a way that fits the system that it's trying to apply it to. That's where there's a bit of a break. So I don't think there's a lack of research and a lack of contribution by research. I think there's a challenge in the application of that.
Reorientation of the research to the smaller scale, if that's necessary.
Exactly.
So 2027 is less than 10 years away now. Are you optimistic that the tipping point, as you put it, can be addressed successfully over this relatively short period of time?
I'm an eternal optimist, so yes.
What has to happen to make that happen then?
Well, like I said, it's really it's policy level changes. It's awareness first. It's a reorientation of the narrative. How do we feed 9 billion people by 2050 to being more shorter term, to have more people aware of it? I think awareness does cause a lot of change, and so we need to still keep driving awareness. And then, awareness will drive the change that's needed by private industry, but also the public sector, and we'll keep pushing it too.
And do you sense that message is getting across ever so incrementally?
One
maybe?
day at a time. It's a big battle to fight, but yeah, it is. And
what is, as a last thought here, the most immediate initiative of Gro Intellegence at this point toward that end?
Well, our job is to make sure that as many players across the ag ecosystem as possible have access to this information and have access to this data that's critical to making decisions, whether day to day, year to year, or decade to decade. And so our efforts now, for a long time had been, how do you build this? How do you actually build a product like this? Now all our efforts are dedicated to how do you get this in the hands of the right people?
Policymakers and
how do you get adoption? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's been a pleasure to have you here on the K-State campus the last couple of days, and certainly appreciate your comments and your input and your inertia in this area, Sarah. Thank you for coming over and spending a few moments with us.
Thank you for having me.
She is the founder and the chief executive officer of Gro Intellegence. That's a technology company that is bridging data gaps across the global agricultural sector and helping decision makers create a more informed and connected and productive global agricultural industry. Sara Menker is her name, and she was the presenter of the 5th Henry C. Gardiner lecture on global food systems last evening here on the Kansas State University campus. Incidentally, you can watch the video of her lecture from last evening at the K-State website. Simply go to k-state.edu and search for Gardiner Lecture, and you can watch her presentation in its entirety. You are tuned to Agriculture Today. Now this break. We'll return with today's agricultural news headlines. That'll include the results of the just concluded Kansas Junior Livestock Show down in Hutchinson, an event co-sponsored by K-State, of course. And K-State's Mike Brook awaits with this week's edition of Milk Lines. That and more still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network. Please keep it right here.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You are tuned to Agriculture Today, coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University. Eric Atkinson here. Now on to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the champions have been chosen at the 2018 Kansas Junior Livestock Show over the weekend in Hutchinson. And here's the rundown. In the Grand Champion Steer Drive, a 1,330-pound crossbred led by Cooper Henson of Holcomb captured top honors. Lauren Ost of the Scene owned the Reserve Grand, a 1,360-pound Charlet. Ashley Kennedy of Satanta showed the Supreme Champion breeding heifer, and Angus Reserve Supreme went to a commercial heifer shown by Abby Wood from Leavenworth. A 290-pound Berkshire shown by Jenna DeRushi of St. Mary's was named Grand Champion Market Hog. Cedar Caruso from Paola exhibited the Reserve Grand Champion, a 275-pound dark crossbred. And the Supreme Breeding Gilt and Champion Commercial was exhibited by Kirby Stroop of Parker. Reserve Supreme honors went to the Reserve Commercial Gilt, owned by Courtney Bates from Downs. Jillian Keller of Peakway owned the Grand Champion Market Lamb, a 150-pound blackface, the Reserve Grand, a 149-pound blackface lamb, shown by Kyler Lee from Burlington. And the Supreme Registered Breeding Ewe honors went to a Hampshire, shown by Carson Keller of Pickway. Reserve Supreme, a Hampshire, led by Kyler Lee from Burlington. Hagen Draper Egea of Lewisburg exhibited the Grand Champion Market Goat, 88-pounder there. The 93-pound Reserve Champion was led by Becca Payne from Hutchinson. And Juliana Sprague of Kincaid led the Supreme Champion Commercial Doe. The Reserve Supreme was shown by Cammie McComb from Pratt. Kansas Junior Livestock Show, sponsored in part by the Kansas Livestock Association, Kansas State University, and the Kansas Department of Agriculture, among numerous other key and generous sponsors. And our congratulations to all the youth who exhibited well at the KJLS in Hutchinson this year. In the headlines, before an upcoming meeting this month by the USDA and the Food and Drug Administration delving into the regulatory and labeling policy questions on cell-based meat, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue says he believes that the FDA has a role to play early on, but that the USDA should have oversight of the products once they reach the commercial stage, which cell-based meat developers predict could be as early as the year 2020. Perdue said he's not aware of any timeline by which the agencies would like to have a regulatory decision made on cell-based products. Quoting Perdue, "We believe the FDA has some equity at the beginning of this process in the laboratory, making sure they're safe products that could be commercialized. When they come to the commercial stage, we think it's the USDA's responsibility to regulate and inspect those products." Perdue went on to say his thinking is in line with an August letter from cell-based meat developer Memphis Meats and the North American Meat Institute, which asked the USDA and the FDA to coordinate and collaborate in their efforts consistent with established policy. And leading into President Trump's trip to Council Bluffs, Iowa today, a senior White House official says that the president has directed the Environmental Protection Agency to create a new rule allowing year-round sales of 15% ethanol blends. The rule, which White House officials expect would be completed by next summer, would reflect a significant win for the ethanol industry, with expectations that more fuel stations would be willing to carry E15 if they could sell it without having to stop for the summer. The EPA will oversee the timeline for drafting and finalizing the rule, but a senior White House official said the goal would be to get the rule finalized in time for the summer driving season next year. The president has made several public comments in support of removing the barrier to E15 and had promised during the 2016 campaign to boost ethanol blend volumes. Last April, the president told reporters the summer hold on E15, in his words, was unnecessary and ridiculous. Back in July, the president said his administration was very close to granting that waiver. Now, the EPA approved the use of E15 back in 2011, but the agency did not grant the waiver on the Reid vapor pressure, which is a measure of fuel volatility, even though E10 had been granted a waiver decades earlier. So retailers in conventional gasoline areas have been prohibited from selling E15 from June the 1st to September 15th up to now. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I wanted to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the use of fat in the lactation diets. You know, when we have tight margins, a lot of times we start looking at ways we can cut cost, and one of the costs that we have is the supplemental fat that we might be feeding to our lactating dairy cows. In particular, those animals that are in early lactation and the animals that we're also trying to get pregnant, keeping in mind that energy balance is very important if they're actually going to conceive. There's been some recent research completed and reported on that might shed some light on this subject as to what we maybe should be thinking about. One of the studies showed that when feeding supplemental fat at 1.5% of the diet dry matter, whether the fat source contained a lot of palmitic, which is a 16-carbon saturated fat, or oleic, which is an 18-carbon fat that contains one double bond, regardless of the percentage, they saw an increase in milk production over not feeding any supplemental fat. In this case, the average increase was 5.6 pounds when they fed the supplemental fat. So as you think about that cost you might incur in feeding supplemental fat to your dairy cow, keep in mind that in early lactation, that might be worth 5.5 pounds of increased milk production. So I think if you think about that and you do some calculations, you'll find that that's actually a very good return on the investment that you've made in supplemental fat. Now, another interesting thing that they found in a separate study was that they broke cows down into level of production. Those cows producing less than 100 pounds of milk versus those cows that were producing more than 120 pounds of milk. They found that in cows that produced more than 120 pounds of milk actually responded better to a diet that contained more oleic acid and less palmitic. However, those animals that were under 100 pounds responded to a diet higher in palmitic. So, as you look at your herd, depending on the size of your herd, might be that we need to feed different types of supplemental fat depending on the level of milk production in those groups. Again, some of these fats are more expensive than others, so that might be a way to trim the cost. In other words, feed the fats that are high in oleic only to those cows that might benefit the most from that. And that would be your higher producing animals probably above 120 pounds. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to think about how they might feed supplemental fat.
Thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State Research and Extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You're listening to Agriculture Today, and to close out this Tuesday edition, our weekly stint on wildlife management. Charlie Lee aboard once again, wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, we're going to examine what may well be a common presumption out there, that feral cats are effective in rat control, and one would understand why a lot of people would think that. However, a recent study more or less refuted that.
Well, there's certainly a lot of folks that believe feral cats are very efficient predators on mice and rats or other wildlife species. This research trial that was conducted in New York City did a great job of looking at actual predation events caused from cats on Norway rats. People have recognized that cats are efficient predators, and unfortunately, cats have evolved to be efficient predators on defenseless prey. A large Norway rat can be almost 3/4 of a pound in size, 10 to 12 ounces in size. That's really too large for many feral cats to efficiently capture as prey. All predators have an energy budget where they have to maximize their calorie intake by the potential risks of the prey items. And a large rat has the ability to fight and perhaps cause injury to the predator. So it may be easier for cats just to find smaller prey items, whether they're rodents or whether they're birds or some other food item. Cats are also very well adapted to survive on handouts from the public. We've noted for many years that cats can represent a very high mortality source for birds and mammals. That's been recognized on islands for many, many years. When you put a cat as a predator on an island that did not evolve with predation events, the cats are devastating. But city rats have coexisted with cats for centuries. Rats are very well adapted for urban ecosystems, and they're a large prey item for all but the boldest and cat, and they can defend themselves. So I think some cities, we still have the public thinking that it's okay to turn cats loose because they're very efficient on preying on some of the rats. In fact, it's a city-wide project in Chicago where cats are often used and widely reported in the media as a rat control tool.
Talk about what this study uncovered then in as far as their effectiveness in rat predation. Again, in New York City, how did they go about measuring this?
Well, the study was designed in a waste management facility. It was an indoor, semi-enclosed facility. It was a facility where rubbish was brought in and then sorted and recycled or disposed of and shipped out. The rats had been in the facility for a long time. They had burrowed under the floor. They were in the walls. They had an estimated rat count of about 150 individuals. They had already caught 37 different rats and microchipped those rats so that they could keep track of where those rats were within the facility. They had a resident cat population of at least 5 different cats that could be identified by various markings. So then they used video cameras to set up in the corners along a rat runway that the cats often patrolled to try to get video of the cat and rat interactions.
So what did they document then in as far as cat predation on rats?
Well, they captured 306 videos of cats and rats that were in the same space. There were 3 instances of predation and 20 stalking events. So out of that time, it seems that there were lots of opportunities, but very few instances where cats were actually considered a mortality factor from the rats. One of the additional things that was found is that there was a repellency effect of having the cats in the area. When a cat was observed in the video, the rats were less likely to be observed either that day or on the next day. So that probably leads to many people thinking, well, the cats are killing and consuming the rats. What this particular paper had concluded was that perhaps the cat's presence is causing the rats to be more secretive and thus leading many people to have a false conclusion that the rats were being killed by the feral cats.
The rats are not vacating the premises, so it comes down to feral cats not being a solution for a specific rat problem in a given area.
Well, I think what it does is show that when cats are present, the rats may shift their movement patterns, but are still present in that system.
So, as far as rat control, those contending with such problems are going to have to look in a different direction.
Well, we've talked many times about the proper procedure to control rodent populations. One thing we need to keep in mind that the first thing is to clean up the area, reduce the food supply, and then look at trying to increase mortality events, whether they're done by natural predators or by trapping or by toxicants.
Well, this question of the effectiveness of feral cats in rat control very well answered in a recent study conducted in New York City. And Charlie, as always, we appreciate the insight. Charlie Lee is a wildlife specialist with K-State Research and Extension. And just a quick footnote before we go, if you've a youth, in 4-H or otherwise, who would be interested in participating in the Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Project, sponsored by K-State this coming year, you might want to check out this resource, the Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Handbook. It's online out of K-State. Great resource. It covers all the details of the rules and guidelines. But moreover, it's a very thorough overview of wildlife management concepts and terms, and then specific habitat information on a long list of wildlife species found here in the Central Plains. Go to the K-State Research and Extension Bookstore, ksre.ksu.edu/bookstore, and search for Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Handbook. This program is a terrific learning opportunity for youth. You can ask more about it as well at your local extension office, of course. And with that, our time's away for today. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.